Welcome back to this course on EU environmental policy and European Green Deal. This is the lecture number 2 in this series, and in the first one I talked about development of EU environmental law, then the role of member states in EU environmental policy making. Now in this lecture number 2 I will be talking about the main EU institutions and their role in environmental decision making, and then how the process of environmental legislation looks like in the EU. And I'm starting from EU institutions. Many people may be familiar who's who in Brussels, so to say, who deals with what, but just to level the playing ground, I will very quickly run through what specific roles of different big EU institutions in environmental decision making, because then it's easier to understand why certain things are done in a way they are done when it comes to EU environmental policy. And as you see, I will talk about 3 big institutions: European Commission, European Parliament and Council of European Union. Of course, there are lots of other institutions and agencies around in EU structure which have direct or indirect link to environmental policy making, but I will only concentrate on those 3 big ones. And I will start from the European Commission. On the picture you see their headquarters in the Berlaymont building in the Schuman Circle. In Brussels, of course, Commission is a big institution, so it's spread around the city. Now, a very quick snapshot on what European Commission is. It's EU institution where roughly 32,000 independent civil servants draft new policies, monitor the implementation by the member states, and then manage EU budget. So those are the 3 main big roles of the European Commission. And Commission actually globally is a very unique institution with what's called supranational mandate, because it's very rare that sovereign countries give up some power to an independent secretariat or an independent institution to act on their behalf. So in this sense, European Commission really is a very unique setting globally. It has political leadership, which is enacted through 27 commissioners, as there are 27 member states, so each member state nominates one politician to serve as commissioner. Commission is chaired by its president, currently Ursula von der Leyen from Germany. Then the Commission staff, the 32,000 people I mentioned, are recruited centrally through highly competitive open process. And perhaps surprisingly to you, I'm stating that number of Commission staff is extremely small. Indeed, 32,000 people sounds like a lot, but when you think that EU member states have around 450 million people, then having 32,000 people managing the common decision making and joint policy making and implementation of the joint policies, this 32,000 people really is a very small number. And Commission's substantive work is done in 33 different departments, which are called Directorates General, or DGs in Brussels slang. They are very similar to in member states what we have as ministries in our federal or national government. In Commission system they're called Directorates General or DGs. Now, on this slide you will see the 27 commissioners designate, as they still are today when I'm recording this, for 2024 till 2029. So they're serving for 5 years, providing political leadership. In the Commission, here you see the list of Commission's DGs or kind of ministries. as they're called in member states. Now, these 32,000 civil servants who work for the European Union, they're hired from the member states, indeed. But from the moment person starts to work for Commission, of course, they are independent, regardless from what country they came from. And the system is built on a way that representation of those civil servants from member states should be equal, so that bigger member states can send more civil servants to European Commission, smaller member states less. In this graph or figure you see indeed bigger member states having more people working in Commission. There is recruitment gap. Working in Commission is not very popular in many member states, so there are some countries like Belgium which is clearly overrepresented, and there are other countries which are underrepresented, and there's continuous fight in Brussels to make sure that the system works more equally for all of the member states. You see from the map that most Commission staff works in Brussels, but they're also working in other locations, both within EU and outside EU, in EU's embassies, which are called delegations of European Union. Coming to environmental part of the European Commission, initially the first 5 environmental experts or environmental officials were hired in 1973. Back then they didn't form a separate unit still, or department in the Commission system. It was only in 1981 when a specific independent department or DG was created to deal with environment. Initially only around 40 people worked in that department. Funnily, it was called back then DG 11. Then EU had this weird system of calling Commission departments with numbers. So I also recall having meetings in Brussels where people talk about DG, I don't know, 9 having to report something to DG 5, and then DG 11 has to comment. It's kind of scene from Orwell's 1984, but then fortunately the system was changed. So today we know these departments by their real names, so it's easier to understand what they deal with. So former DG 11 is now called, of course, DG Environment. In 2010 it was split so that the people working on climate change were moved into a newly created separate department which deals with climate. And today there's roughly 450 officials or civil servants working in DG Environment, and almost 300 then working in DG Klima. And DG Environment, or those environmental civil servants or officials in Commission, work both with environment and sustainable development is also part of their mandate. Now, what's the structure of DG Environment? It's very similar to what we have in national or federal ministries of environment. So there are top-level managers, and then it's built into departments dealing with biodiversity or circular economy or other topics. Now, when you look at different directorates general in the European Commission system, then of course there are some which have much more stuff, which are much bigger, which have much bigger budgets, exactly the same way like we have different ministries in our national or federal systems. And on this graph you see DG Environment and DG Klima being highlighted. Of course, in the comparison you see they are among the smaller DGs in Commission system. Council of the European Union, or Council in short, is the other big EU institution which plays extremely important role in its environmental decision making. And on this photo you see their headquarters at Justus Lipsius building in Brussels, just across the road from the European Commission. Council means member states. So Council is the place where all EU member states come together to basically defend their national interests. So what Council deals with is they're forming common positions regarding draft laws presented by European Commission. So as I mentioned, only European Commission can draft new EU regulation. And then this draft regulation goes to Council, and then Member States discuss and form their common vision or decision about this draft documents. So they coordinate Member States' policies, they enter into international agreements, for example, they adopt EU budget, and they have some other rules in the EU system. What's special about Council is that, as it represents Member States, in its discussions it's always 27 people around the table. 27 because currently there are 27 EU Member States. The way it functions in a daily basis is that there are around 150 different committees, which are called working parties in Council. So whenever a new draft document arrives from the Commission, then Council chooses which would be the most suitable working party to discuss this document. And the discussions initially are done between national experts. Experts from the Member States, coming from Member State national or federal ministries, but because they meet weekly to discuss draft documents, then indeed those national experts actually are residing in Brussels, in the embassies or representatives of the Member States, because it's much cheaper to keep those people working in Brussels instead of flying them every week to those discussions in Brussels. These meetings are chaired by rotating EU presidency, and once those national experts, which have been sent there from ministries, have done their work, their negotiations, then those more important decisions go to deputy ambassadors and ambassadors of the Member States, and then to the level of national ministers, which have to make the final choices on those draft documents. And there is Secretariat indeed in the Council which supports their work. Now when it comes to environmental decisions and negotiations in the Council, there are two permanent working parties or committees, the ones working on environment and on international environmental issues, and two more ad hoc working parties. So whenever a draft document comes from the European Commission, it lands in one of those committees in the Council, and then 27 people around the table will start discussing this draft and trying to defend their national interests in the Council. As I said, one Member State chairs the Council work, which is called presidency. It's shifting every 6 months, so you see on the graph in the right the list of countries, for example 2024, 25, 26, so every year there is one shift. So first half a year one country has this presidency role, then the second half of the year another country takes over, and it goes on like this all the time. What's important task for these presidencies of the Council is that, of course, they chair the meetings, they prepare the logistics, but they also formulate compromises. Because always there is some disagreement between Member States, some countries want one thing and others another. There's a lot of different ideas around the table, so presidency formulates compromises between the Member States. So they have quite big power diplomatically or politically in having that role. And of course, when it comes to environmental policy, things can happen when it happens to be that one very ambitious Member State when it comes to environmental matters is having presidency. There are examples in past, like Denmark being rotating presidency or having rotating presidency of EU back in 2002 during the UN Sustainable Development Summit, where EU played a very active role, or 2006 when Finland had presidency and they prioritized energy and climate issues back then in the EU, or 2009 actually, in the middle of financial crisis globally, Sweden had presidency role in EU, and it was still able to keep priority on climate and CO2 tax, despite really difficult situation of the financial crisis and all sorts of other concerns for the EU. So presidency does matter. Another complicated figure basically showing on columns different years, and you see EU presidencies being changed every half a year, so different countries being in charge of presidency. And then in the lines you see, well coded but doesn't matter, different multilateral environmental agreements. So big agreements being discussed at the United Nations. And as you see, those discussions go on for several years, for years and years. So it means also for this big international environmental negotiations, during negotiating process, EU presidencies change. They change several times, and there is a very smooth way on how different member states give the dossier over to the next one to make sure that EU's position is stable on those negotiations, so there are no big surprises in the process. So indeed, this presidency system is a bit difficult for member states to manage, but we have a lot of history in doing so, so it goes on quite smooth. On environmental issues, the meeting of environmental ministers, the 27 ministers in this format in the Council, is called Environmental Council. So every member state sends their environmental minister to those meetings and discussions. They normally take place in Brussels. This format was created in 1973. Then in 77 ministers started to meet twice because there was more and more environmental issues to deal with. Today environmental ministers meet at least 4 times every year. And what's important is that Environmental Council has become quite prestigious. Because historically and in some other fields of work, it may happen that a country sends its deputy minister or a lower rank politician to those meetings, but what we see in real life with Environmental Council is that ministers come, they show up, they discuss those issues because environment is really high priority in the EU, and it's very positive to have this kind of high prestige of those Environmental Council meetings. I have it in brackets the European Council, which is a specific format which legally speaking is not an official EU institution, but I show it on a slide on the Council because this is meeting of the heads of state of EU member states. So normally prime ministers from few countries, presidents attend those meetings. So the highest political level meeting of member states again, and the aim of those meetings is to give broad political guidance to EU processes. So whatever issues, including the ones on environment or climate, which experts from the member states or deputy ambassadors, even ministers were not able to negotiate and solve, then land on the desks of presidents or prime ministers. So this format, the European Council, then ultimately has to solve those disputes between the member states, and those meetings again at least 4 times a year, and meetings presided by Charles Michel, the former Prime Minister of Belgium. The third big EU institution is European Parliament. Parliament indeed is directly elected by EU citizens in all of the member states, so having a very different mandate compared to European Commission, which I discussed first, where basically you have a lot of people who were recruited based on their competency to work for EU, then the Council, which represents the interests of member states, and now the Parliament, where politicians elected by EU citizens are sitting to play their role in EU decision making. This photo shows the main hall of the parliament in Strasbourg. Parliament has this strange historical setup that, although it works and has its offices and stuff in Brussels in Belgium, the entire parliament, so thousands of people, travel for a few days every month to Strasbourg in France to have their meetings there. Indeed, a strange traveling circus or setup which causes a lot of ecological and climate damage and wastes a lot of EU money. Anyway, as I said, European Parliament is the only EU body which is directly elected by EU citizens, and this indeed gives them very strong voice and very strong mandate in EU decision-making system. It initially was indeed much smaller. Today there are 718 members of the European Parliament who are elected from the member states, and indeed from bigger member states there are more deputies or members of the European Parliament elected. So the biggest number comes from Germany, 96, and from smaller member states indeed less deputies. Members of the European Parliament are elected for 5 years. The latest elections were in 2024, so their mandate lasts till 2029. And what's very important is that members of the European Parliament work in political groups. There are currently 8 political groups, so they don't defend their national interests. They don't sit in their national delegations, no. They sit in their political groups or political parties and defend their political interests. Now, when it comes to environmental policy, it's really important to underline that from the very beginning, European Parliament, compared to Commission and Council, has clearly been a locomotive of a strong environmental policy in EU. So in cases where maybe member states don't want to do that much, or Commission is not ready to propose radical enough environmental agenda and goals, almost always Parliament has had much more ambitious ideas about environmental policy, so playing a really, really important role in environmental decision making. And all the Parliament posts are divided according to the share of representation of different political groups in a Parliament. You see on the slide the current number of Parliament deputies or members of European Parliament, MEPs. The biggest group is Conservatives, then Socialists, then 2 Conservative or Eurosceptic groups, then Liberals, Greens and others. On this figure you see again the sizes of political groups in a parliament from left to right wing in a current European Parliament. Well, probably won't see this graph from your screens, but again here you see how many people were elected from different member states and then which parliament political groups those elected deputies of the European Parliament chose to join. Now when it comes to environmental policy, there are a lot of independent institutions around who have been monitoring how different people in the Parliament vote, how different MEPs vote on environmental matters and on other issues indeed. And based on this kind of long-standing analysis on the votes and decisions and choices made by deputies from different political groups, different analysts have clustered deputies into 3 groups. So on environmental matters, the progressive group normally has Greens, it's kind of obvious. Then the left party, which in its group also includes Nordic Green Left party members, then Social Democrats also in this progressive group. When it comes to environmental votes and decision making, then the middle bloc, where Liberals or Renew Europe belong, and then the opponents to environmental decisions, different conservative, Eurosceptic national groups in the Parliament. And yeah, the grouping can be called different and it can be done a bit differently. I just show a few examples where different independent monitors are again tracing the decisions by different deputies and then clustering those parliament groups. Again here the Earth Champions group is consisting of Greens, Left, Social Democrats, then the Flip-Flops on ecology, the Renew Europe, the Liberal group, and then the Planet Destroyers, as it's titled here, other conservative and Eurosceptic and right-wing groups, and basically the same figure but just shown on left-right scale. So again, not surprisingly, the parliament groups who want to see stronger environmental policy for the EU come from left side of the political spectrum, then liberals being in between, and the right-wing and conservative parties more skeptical or the ones who don't want to see that strong environmental policy for the EU. And another very similar comparison done by big environmental NGO networks in the European Union, again based on real votes by the members of parliament on climate, nature and pollution issues, then the groups end up being exactly the same. So the environmental protectors being Greens, Left and Social Democrats, then the middle group Liberals, and then the what they call here prehistoric thinkers from different conservative and Eurosceptic groups. This was a very brief overview of what are the three big EU institutions which play a central role in environmental decision making. I must stress once more that actually the picture is much more colorful. There are other really important institutions in the EU structure, like Court of Justice of the European Union, Economic and Social Committee, Committee of Regions, the European Environmental Agency, which I mentioned in the first lecture, and others. So there are many more EU institutions playing their role in environmental decision making, but those three are really the most important ones. So once again, Commission, which is the only one which is allowed to start drafting new legislation. So all new pieces of legislation initially come from Commission and then they're being discussed. And now finally, let me very briefly run through the process of environmental legislation between those three big EU institutions. And I do divide this process into 4 stages. So agenda setting, policy formulation, adoption and implementation. And now I go very quickly through all those stages. And indeed, the kind of precondition, and it's very logical, is that there is a problem to be solved. Either there is scientific evidence, there is huge public pressure or media pressure to do something about a given environmental problem. Then the first stage, agenda setting, indeed you can tackle it from the kind of top down. So whenever European Parliament elections took place, so there is a new European Commission at this political level of 27 commissioners starting their 5-year work in the Commission. The President of the European Commission sets 5-year plan for the Commission, so current one being from 24 to 29, where they underline their big political or policy priorities. Then annually the Commission publishes its work program for the next year, which basically is a plan of new legislation. There can be new initiatives, some of which are listed below here as a sample of the latest such document from the Commission. Now on this slide, again hardly visible, sorry for that, are pending proposals. So Commission for the next year indicates that these are the directives and regulations we plan to propose next year, and then everybody has this early warning that yes, these are the topics also in the field of environment that Commission will be working next year. And of course those documents are publicly available, so people can make their comments, they can see what documents, what drafts will be upcoming from the Commission to the other EU institutions, but also everybody can see and can comment, and there's a database where you can go and search for those documents. When Commission starts drafting a new proposal, first what happens within the European Commission is that they appoint a department or Directorate General, DG, in the Commission system, which will coordinate the preparation of draft legislation. And of course, when we talk about environmental dossiers, then most logically that's the DG Environment, the Environmental Department of the European Commission, which will be in charge of this process. And then within Environmental Department of the Commission or DG Environment, they appoint a specific middle manager, so one specific person with a face and name called chef de dossier, who will personally be in charge of running that process of creating a new proposal for a legal act. The second stage is policy formulation. So this coordinating department or Directorate General creates different working groups with experts from Commission, Member States, key stakeholders, and then they conduct a formal consultation process with the public. And why this process is immediately so wide and so transparent and so open is that Commission wants to make sure that their draft is what I call bulletproof. Because nobody wants to draft a new EU initiative or directive in silence, because there's a lot of experience for everybody in the Commission that there can be surprises. You may think that you developed an ideal piece of paper, but you don't want to see it being heavily criticized and trashed later in the process. So the idea is that from the very beginning this process is open. Different interest groups and other parts of the Commission and Member States and European Parliament members indeed can see from the very beginning what's the logic, where European Commission wants to move, how and why they want to regulate. So yes, Commission wants this document to be from the very beginning kind of bulletproof for them so that they don't face surprises later in the process. So this chef de dossier, or the person inside the Environmental Department, will carry this document through consultation with other departments of the European Commission. Then different impact assessments are done importantly in parallel of drafting this new document. So there are independent assessments of potential impacts of this new directive, for example, on economy, social impacts, environmental impacts, so that when different stakeholders discuss this draft document, they already know what may happen once we adopt this new document. And then there is formal inter-service consultation between all DGs or departments of the European Commission. And then once these negotiations and comments and amendments have been done within the Commission system, then it goes to the highest political level in the Commission, to the College of 27 Commissioners. They negotiate the final text and then they approve those new directives or regular regulations in their weekly meetings. Then comes adoption. So, okay, Commission had done its work. It has drafted a new piece of legislation, has been agreed. Then this text moves to the Council, so EU member states, and the European Parliament. So both these two big institutions will propose their amendments, their changes to this text. And there are opinions being sought from other official EU institutions. And then these three big institutions, Commission, Council and Parliament, will enter into negotiations. So they will form their negotiating teams, and there are first, second and third readings and phases, and then at the end conciliation if needed. So at the end of the day, those three big institutions will negotiate and they must find common ground before the final decision can be made. For a quicker and smoother process, an informal trialogue between those three institutions is formed, because everybody wants to have things done rather quicker than later. So the attempt always is that already during the first reading the agreement would be reached. And then indeed there is implementation stage. So after adoption of, let's say, a new directive on environmental issue, the nitty-gritty or the tiny details on how to implement, how to measure, how to collect data, all those details will be agreed actually later during what's called comitology procedure in the EU. So this was the second lecture in my course on EU environmental policy and European Green Deal.